This city should not exist. It was born in mud, baptized in fire, and nearly erased more times than history can comfortably record. Before the spires, before the scholars, before the prestige, there was only a shallow river crossing where cattle trudged through cold water under gray English skies. No prophecy marked it, no empire crowned it. And yet, over the next 1,000 years, this unremarkable patch of land would witness massacre, plague, civil war, religious executions, industrial upheaval, 2 world wars, and scientific breakthroughs that would save millions of lives. People were burned alive here, armies besieged it, kings used it, rebels defended it, disease hollowed it out, and somehow it kept reinventing itself. The same city that once trapped terrified refugees inside a church and set it ablaze would later help produce penicillin at scale and co-develop a vaccine distributed to billions. This is not just the story of a university. It is the story of a place that absorbed catastrophe, reorganized around it, and refused to disappear. Long before Oxford carried prestige, it carried risk. Archaeological evidence shows that as early as 100 AD, Romans were firing pottery on this ground. Excavations in 2003 unearthed a Roman pot dated to around 100 AD, proof of life, but not permanence. One pot was inscribed with the name Temizabugus, meaning simply Thames dweller. They built kilns, shaped clay, and moved on. Nothing about this place suggested destiny. The real beginning came centuries later with the Saxons, who named it Oxenford, the ford of the oxen. Around the 8th century, Saxon settlers discovered that the Thames here split into many shallow channels, creating a passable crossing for people, goods, and livestock. A settlement grew around it. There is still debate about the precise location of the original ford. Archaeological evidence generally points to the southwest of the town, where low elevations and branching streams offered the shallowest ground. Around 727 AD, a young noblewoman named Fritiswide made a decision that would change the settlement's character. Refusing marriage, she founded a religious house near the river crossing, a small priory on the site where Christ Church Cathedral stands today. She is Oxford's patron saint. Her church became the city's first significant building, and what she planted, faith, stone, permanence, outlasted the settlement that surrounded it. By 911, England was being torn apart by Viking raids, and the Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that King Edward the Elder came into possession of London and Oxford, and all the regions which owed obedience to these cities. Oxford had a name and a strategic purpose. Edward recognized the crossing's military value and ordered fortifications. The ford became a frontier town, tense and exposed, a burh, a fortified Saxon settlement defending the northern frontier of Wessex from Danish expansion. Oxford was constructed on the northern bank of the Thames, within Mercia, directly opposite the southern side within the territory of Wessex. It was a border posting, and border towns attract violence. Then came the 13th of November, 1002, St. Brice's Day. King Ethelred the Unready ordered the killing of Danish settlers across England. In Oxford, terrified Danish men, women, and children fled to St. Fritiswide's church, seeking sanctuary behind sacred walls. The doors were barred, the building was set on fire, they burned alive inside. Among the dead was Gunhild, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, a king who now had every reason to return with an army. In 1003, Sweyn invaded. In 1004, Oxford was sacked. Oxford's story does not begin with beauty. It begins with vulnerability and fire, a settlement forced to survive its own violence before it ever imagined shaping the world. In 1066, the balance of England shattered. William of Normandy crossed the Channel, defeated King Harold at Hastings, and claimed the crown. Oxford did not resist. It submitted, but submission was not safety. It was surveillance. Within 2 years, William ordered the construction of Oxford Castle. a massive stone fortress rising above the timber homes and narrow lanes of the town. Robert D'Oyley, one of William's most trusted knights, was given charge of the city and oversaw the building. He also ordered the construction of a stone causeway, Grand Pont, to carry traffic across the floodplains. Inside the castle, D'Oyley established a small monastic community, a chapel and living quarters for monks dedicated to St. George. That community never grew large, but it holds a distinction. It is one of Britain's oldest documented places of formal education. It was here, in 1139, that Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote his History of the Kings of Britain, the compilation of Arthurian legend that would shape centuries of English mythology. The castle's most dramatic hour came during the Anarchy, the civil war of the mid-12th century between Empress Matilda and King Stephen fought over who should rule England. In 1141, Matilda seized Oxford Castle, claiming the throne. Stephen responded with siege. Winter tightened its grip. Food ran thin. The river froze solid. For 3 months, the castle endured. Then, on a snow-covered night in December 1142, Matilda wrapped herself in white to vanish against the landscape and slipped across the frozen Thames with 3 loyal knights. By dawn, she was gone. The castle surrendered the following day. Stephen took the city, but Matilda had escaped. The war dragged on for another 11 years in bitter stalemate before exhausted parties agreed that Stephen would keep the throne for his lifetime and Matilda's son Henry would inherit it when Stephen died. Oxford had again survived, not by dominance, but by endurance. This city did not control power. Power kept choosing it as its battlefield. By the early 12th century, something quieter but far more consequential than any castle began taking shape in Oxford. Scholars started gathering, not by royal decree, not by grand design, but by necessity. Evidence of teaching in Oxford stretches back to 1096. By the 1120s, lectures were being documented here, delivered in rented halls and private lodgings, informal yet growing. Then, in 1167, King Henry II made a decision that permanently altered the city's destiny. Furious with France, he banned English students from attending the University of Paris. Hundreds of displaced scholars needed a new home. They came to Oxford. The trickle became a flood, and teaching evolved from scattered instruction into structured community. But intellectual energy did not bring harmony. Tensions between townspeople and scholars ran deep and constant. Students were often exempt from local laws. They drove up rents. The locals worked hard and resented these privileged young men treating their town like a playground. In 1209, a scholar was accused of killing a local woman. The enraged townspeople hanged 2 of his innocent colleagues in retaliation. Shocked and fearful, many scholars fled. Some settled in a smaller town to the northeast, on the River Cam. A rival university was born from Oxford's trauma. The relationship between town and gown, referring to the academic robes worn by members of the universities, it was never easy, and this would not be the last time that tension turned bloody. To prevent further disorders, the papal legate drew up the Oxford Ordinance in 1214, granting scholars special rights and placing them in a privileged legal position beyond the reach of ordinary townspeople. Oxford was no longer just surviving political power. It was institutionalizing intellectual power. And ideas, once institutionalized, outlast kings. In the late 1200s, the colleges began to appear. University College, Balliol, and Merton, all established sometime between 1249 and 1264, are Oxford's oldest, though each institution still disputes the exact claim. These were not merely schools, they were a new model. Self-governing communities of scholars with their own statutes, endowments, and permanent foundations. Knowledge, for the first time in Oxford, gained infrastructure. It was no longer dependent on a single teacher or passing generation. It became anchored in stone, sustained by rules and revenue. Among the great minds drawn to this new intellectual hub were the friars. Roger Bacon, or the English Franciscan philosopher and an early advocate for empirical science, lectured at Oxford from 1247 to 1257. Duns Scotus and William of Ockham followed. Oxford was also home to a thriving Jewish community, one of the earliest in England. Jewish financiers were essential to Oxford's medieval economy, since Christians were forbidden by church law to lend money at interest. They helped finance civic projects across the city and beyond, including Westminster Abbey. Then the 14th century arrived, and with it, catastrophe. In 1349, the Black Death reached Oxford. Within months, somewhere between a third and half of the city's entire population was dead. Scholars, merchants, monks, children. Death made no distinction. Lecture halls emptied. Entire households vanished overnight. The university nearly collapsed from the sheer loss of students and teachers. But survival did not bring peace. On February 10th, 1355, the feast day of St. Scholastica, a dispute at the Swindlestock Tavern ignited one of the bloodiest urban riots in medieval England. Two students complained about the quality of the wine. The landlord argued back. Insults flew, then punches. The students threw their drinks in his face. Within hours, the situation was beyond control. For 3 days, Oxford descended into chaos. Townspeople attacked scholars with swords and bows. Rural men arrived from the surrounding countryside to join the assault on the university. By the time the violence ended, as many as 93 students and townspeople were dead. King Edward III sided decisively with the university. As punishment, Oxford's mayor and civic leaders were required to attend an annual mass and pay penance for the dead scholars. That humiliating ritual continued for 470 years, nearly half a millennium. The wounds between town and gown never fully disappeared. The 16th century brought a different kind of terror. Faith weaponized. In 1517, the sweating sickness epidemic struck Oxford with devastating force, killing roughly half of the city's population, including many students and dons. Then came the larger rupture. Henry VIII's break with Rome shattered religious stability across England. In Oxford, officials threw books relating to Roman Catholicism out of the university's libraries. Monasteries were dissolved. Osney Abbey and Raleigh Abbey, institutions that had shaped the city for generations, were torn down, their stones repurposed. Oxford was not spared the turmoil of the Reformation. Then came the fires. Under Queen Mary I, a Catholic queen determined to reverse her father's Protestant reforms, Oxford became the site of some of the most infamous executions in English history. In 1555 and 1556, on what is now Broad Street, 3 men were burned at the stake for heresy. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, Hugh Latimer, Bishop, Nicholas Ridley, Bishop. All 3 had been educated at Cambridge. All 3 were condemned and executed here in Oxford. The site is marked today by a cross set into the road surface on Broad Street and a plaque in the wall of Balliol College. Just around the corner on St. Giles's stands the Martyrs Memorial. Designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott and erected in 1843. Oxford endured plague, riot, and religious fury, not untouched, but unextinguished. In 1642, England fractured once more. King Charles I, driven from London by a hostile parliament, chose Oxford as his capital. Overnight, the university city became the nerve center of royalist resistance. Christ Church housed the king and his court. The king even held parliament at Christ Church. College quadrangles echoed with drilling soldiers instead of scholars. Lecture halls stored ammunition. Dormitories became barracks. The city's population expanded by roughly 50%, causing serious overcrowding, disease, and civil unrest. Food grew scarce. Parliamentarian forces tightened their grip around the city, cutting supply lines. Fear settled across the streets. Yet even as war reshaped daily life, students continued studying when they could, clinging to books while cannon fire sounded beyond stone walls. Oxford was besieged multiple times. In 1646, with defeat inevitable, Charles slipped away from the city disguised as a servant and fled under cover of darkness. Oxford surrendered shortly afterward. Parliament's troops marched in. Much of the medieval stonework of Oxford Castle was deliberately dismantled, to prevent it ever again serving as a royalist stronghold. It was an act not just of demolition, but of symbolic erasure. Only St. George's Tower was spared. It was needed as the county prison. With the restoration of Charles II in 1660, Oxford regained royal favor. The king remembered the city's loyalty, and investment poured into new construction. In 1664, the Sheldonian Theatre was designed by a young Christopher Wren, one of his first major works, and a bold statement of renewal from a city emerging from trauma. In 1681, Charles II called a parliament in Oxford to avoid London's hostile crowds. It met in the Convocation House and lasted just 1 week before Charles dissolved it. It was the last time an English parliament met outside London. Oxford ended its most violent century battered but intact, its university stronger than ever. The 18th century was Oxford's age of reason. The university produced some of the greatest minds in British history. John Locke's ideas on liberty and governance spread across Europe and would inspire revolutions. Adam Smith studied here before writing The Wealth of Nations. Edmund Halley became a civilian professor of geometry at Oxford and predicted the return of the comet that now bears his name. New colleges appeared. Worcester College was founded in 1714, rising from the ruins of Gloucester College. The city streets were paved and new bridges built. In 1749, the Radcliffe camera was completed in Radcliffe Square. Circular, confident, and unlike anything else in England. Designed by James Gibbs and funded by a bequest from physician John Radcliffe, it was built to house the Radcliffe Science Library. The word camera is simply Latin for room. Today it serves as a reading room for the Bodleian Library. The Bodleian itself, opened in 1602 by Thomas Bodley with a collection of 2,000 books, now holds over 9 million items. It is a legal deposit library entitled to request a free copy of every book published in Britain, yet the university remained deeply conservative. Religious tests excluded anyone who was not Anglican. Catholics, Protestant dissenters, and Jews could not attend. Women were completely barred. The curriculum focused on classics and theology. Critics called Oxford complacent, more interested in privilege than progress. In 1790, the Oxford Canal opened, connecting the city with Coventry and the Midlands, bringing cheap coal and transforming trade. The legacy of Oxford's canal community lives on today, with people still living and holidaying on the city's waterways. The canal trade would be eclipsed in the mid-19th century by the arrival of the railway. But for now, Oxford was at last connected to the country it helped govern. The 19th century transformed Oxford from a medieval university town into a modern industrial city. In 1844, the Great Western Railway arrived, linking Oxford to London. Travel that had taken days now took hours. Middle-class Victorians flooded in to admire what the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold, in his poem Thyrsis, called "that sweet city with her dreaming spires." Tourism was born. But the railway also brought industry. Working-class suburbs sprang up around the station. The population exploded, from roughly 12,000 in 1801 to over 49,000 by 1901. The university underwent its own revolution, slowly and under pressure. In 1854, Parliament forced Oxford to open its doors wider. religious tests were gradually abolished. In 1860, the University Museum of Natural History opened, a Gothic revival masterpiece that in its very first year hosted the now famous debate between biologist Thomas Henry Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. The battle between faith and science played out literally in Oxford's halls. In 1878, the first women's colleges were established, Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville College. Women could now attend lectures and take examinations, but they would not receive full degrees until 1920, 42 years later. In 1896, a local businessman named William Morris founded a small enterprise on Longwall Street. He started with bicycles. By 1910, he had opened an assembly plant at Cowley, on the southeastern edge of the city, and was mass-producing automobiles. Morris Motors would become one of Britain's major car manufacturers, and the impact on Oxford was permanent. Thousands of workers flooded in, particularly from former mining communities in South Wales, Yorkshire, and Derbyshire. The city became, in the wry phrase of the time, the left bank of Cowley, a city of two halves, the ancient university to the west of Magdalen Bridge and the industrial car town to the east. Meanwhile, the Oxford movement, a religious revival led by John Henry Newman, shook the Church of England and left its own quiet mark on British culture. Among its lesser-known legacies, historians credit the Tractarians with helping revive the Victorian Christmas, the church decorations, the charitable services, the traditions that Oliver Cromwell had suppressed in the 1650s. By the 1870s, the Victorian Christmas we recognize today was in full bloom, partly because of Oxford. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Oxford threw itself into the war effort. The university emptied as students and dons enlisted. Colleges were converted into hospitals and officer training facilities. Over 14,000 Oxford alumni served. More than 2,700 never returned. Memorial plaques still line chapel walls, quiet testament to a lost generation. Morris Motors halted civilian production and converted its assembly lines to manufacture munitions, feeding the machinery of modern warfare. After the war, Morris Motors exploded in scale. By the 1920s, it was producing thousands of cars annually. The Morris Oxford, Morris Minor, and later the Mini became icons of British motoring. Cowley became a working-class industrial district, a stark contrast to the university's ancient streets. The city's economy diversified beyond the university for the first time in centuries, but prosperity also exposed division. In 1934, 9-foot brick walls, topped with rotating metal spikes, were erected overnight, cutting through streets of the Cutteslowe estate. They physically separated working-class council housing from privately built middle-class homes. Residents woke up to find their routes blocked and their access to shops suddenly longer. The outrage was immediate. Protests erupted. The Oxford Mail ran blistering editorials. The walls stayed up for 25 years. They came down in 1959 after years of sustained campaigning. Today, you can walk from cobblestoned college quadrangles to working-class neighborhoods in 5 minutes. Two worlds, still not quite touching. Meanwhile, in the Eagle and Child pub on St. Giles's Street, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were meeting regularly with a group of friends they called the Inklings, reading unfinished manuscripts aloud, drinking, and arguing. The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia were drafted, debated, and refined in Oxford pubs and college rooms. When the Second World War began in 1939, Oxford feared the worst. Blackout curtains covered ancient windows. Air raid shelters were dug. The Morris Works shifted again to war production, building tanks, munitions, and aircraft parts. And inside the Dunn School of Pathology, a different kind of work was underway. Building on Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin mold, Howard Florey and Ernst Chain developed methods to purify and mass-produce the compound. Fleming had found the mold in London. Oxford is where it became medicine. By 1942, they had succeeded. Penicillin saved countless soldiers and civilians from infections that would have killed them in any previous conflict. It is one of the most important medical breakthroughs in history, and it happened in Oxford. Miraculously, Oxford was largely spared from German bombing during the Blitz. While Coventry, London, and Birmingham were devastated, Oxford survived almost unscathed. Whether this was deliberate German policy, some accounts claim Hitler intended to make Oxford the capital of an occupied Britain, or simply the absence of heavy industry that would have made it a target, historians still debate. The fact remains, the spires stood while other cities burned. Then, on 6 May 1954, at the Iffley Road running track, medical student Roger Bannister ran a mile in 3 minutes and 59.4 seconds, the first authenticated sub-4-minute mile in history. The city that had endured sieges and epidemics for 1,000 years now shattered the limits of human performance. In the second half of the 20th century, Oxford changed again. Following the Second World War, waves of immigrants arrived from Pakistan, the Caribbean, South Asia, and across the world, drawn to Oxford's hospitals and factories. Their lives and families became part of the city's fabric. The Cowley Road area, with its restaurants, markets, and annual carnival, reflects a city far more diverse than the ancient college postcards suggest. By recent population estimates, 22% of Oxford's residents are from Black or minority ethnic groups, compared to 13% across England. More than a third of all residents were born outside the United Kingdom. Morris Motors merged with Austin to form the British Motor Corporation, then became part of British Leyland in 1968. The company lurched through strikes and decline. By the 1980s, British Leyland had collapsed. The Cowley plant survived, eventually passing to BMW, and today produces the reborn Mini. The glory days of British mass car manufacturing are over. In 1974, the first 5 men's colleges finally admitted women, breaking centuries of exclusion. Oxford Brookes University, formerly the Oxford Polytechnic, was granted its charter in 1991. Then, in 2020, Oxford stepped onto the global stage in a way it had not since the penicillin years. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world, scientists at the university partnered with AstraZeneca to develop one of the first effective vaccines. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was supplied to more than 180 countries. Approximately 3 billion doses were delivered, largely to low and middle-income nations. The city that was nearly destroyed by plague in 1349, that watched half its population die from the sweating sickness in 1517, that survived the Black Death, cholera, and Civil War, was now helping to protect the world from a new epidemic. Today, Oxford is a city of approximately 165,000 people. The university, composed of 38 colleges and 6 permanent private halls, educates around 25,000 students from across the globe. It consistently ranks among the top universities in the world. Its alumni include 31 British prime ministers and over 70 Nobel Prize winners. The challenges are real. Housing costs have made Oxford one of the least affordable cities in Britain. Traffic clogs medieval streets, not built for the 21st century. The university's enormous wealth sits in tension with underfunded local services. Town and gown tensions persist, in new forms, in new arguments, but recognizably the same dispute that has echoed down Oxford streets for 8 centuries. Oxford's story is not a straight line of glory. It is a record of survival under pressure. It began as a muddy river crossing. It hardened into a frontier fortress. It burned in massacre. It was emptied by plague. It was divided by riot. It was shaken by religious reformation. It was militarized by civil war. It was industrialized by rail and factory smoke. And it was thrust into global responsibility through science and medicine. It has been a place of privilege and protest, of faith and fire, of exclusion and expansion. And yet, through every rupture, one pattern repeats: adaptation. Oxford does not endure because it avoided catastrophe. It endures because it absorbed it, reorganized around it, and turned crisis into structure. Castles fell, but colleges rose. Religious fury scorched its streets, yet inquiry continued. Industry divided neighborhoods, yet imagination flourished in pubs and laboratories. From a cattle crossing on a cold river to vaccine research that circled the globe, its influence stretches far beyond its narrow streets. Cities are defined not by the blows they avoid, but by the transformations they survive. From cattle ford to COVID vaccine, from Saxon mud to dreaming spires, this is Oxford. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Let me know and comment that on which topic you want next video. Take care, and I see you in next video.